Hey guys, today's story is a little different. You ever walk into a room where your own family doesn't quite meet your eyes? Where you feel like a misplaced object in a home you grew up in? That was my childhood. My name's Ian, I'm 34, and I run a mid-sized design tech company out of Chicago. But none of that ever meant much in the house I came from. Because there, I wasn't Ian the entrepreneur, I was Ian the, well, he tries, bless his heart. And if you think karma's slow, wait until you hear this. So, before you get pulled in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually believe that betrayal always comes back around. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether someone in your life ever looked straight through you like you didn't exist. Now sit back, let the room go quiet, and let me tell you how it really went down. I was the second child, which, I quickly learned, meant I was second everything. My sister Clara was the crown jewel. She was always introduced with glowing resumes, awards, college letters. Meanwhile I was, well, Ian, he's figuring things out. They'd say with the same tone you use for a broken microwave you can't quite throw out yet. When Clara got into Stanford, there were banners on our lawn. When I launched my first online store, my dad squinted and said, "Is that like Craigslist?" I was 15. Growing up in that house meant your value was measured in applause, and if you didn't make noise, you didn't matter. I learned to live with silence. Dinners were the worst. Clara would talk about debate nationals or her new internship, and the table would nod like her words were gospel. I'd mention I made $500 in one weekend flipping sneakers online, and Mom would say, "Let's talk about something everyone can relate to." Everyone. Except me. I don't think it was always malicious. It was subtler than that, something about how expectations were drawn around us like chalk outlines. Clara was destined for brilliance. I was the family's slow burn, the hope you don't catch fire type. Even holidays followed the script. My gifts were always more practical. One year, Clara got a MacBook. I got socks. You needed them, Mom said, smiling. But the worst came during family reunions. That's when the full hierarchy played out in public. At one, my dad literally stood up in front of 40 relatives, raised a glass, and said, "To my daughter Clara, who never gave us a reason to doubt. And to Ian, who we know will get there someday." They all laughed. I did too, but only with my mouth. Inside, something sank. And it stayed sunk for years. I tried hard not to resent Clara. Honestly, she wasn't the villain. She just fit the image they worship: clean, confident, predictable. Me? I had hustle, but it was the messy kind. I tinkered with code, ran small online businesses, worked nights at cafes to fund them. Nothing glamorous. Nothing easy to brag about over cocktails. My parents never saw it as building. They saw it as drifting. Still, I didn't stop. I couldn't. Maybe deep down I was still trying to get a seat at the adult table. Or maybe I just wanted to build a world that didn't shrink when I walked into it. Either way, by the time I hit 28, I had something real. A startup that didn't just survive, I thrived. We developed a modular design tool that helped small e-commerce shops automate their branding. Unsexy? Maybe. Profitable? Extremely. Within 2 years, we scaled into 7 figures. And in all that time, I don't think my parents asked me a single question about how I did it. Then Clara got engaged. You'd think the queen of the family would have had a royal wedding. Instead, it was a quiet city hall ceremony. No big party. No drama. But when she posted a single photo with her husband online, my parents printed it and framed it. When I got engaged 6 months later, I didn't even get a call. Just a text from Mom that said, "Congrats. Can't believe our little Ian found someone patient enough." That word, patient, cut more than it should have. We sent the invitations anyway. Formal ones. Embossed. Custom designed. I watched for the RSVP that never came. When I finally called to follow up, Dad chuckled and said, "It just didn't feel necessary, son. We've done the wedding thing already. You know how it goes." Then he added, "Besides, it's not like anyone else in the family is flying out, right?" That was it. That was the moment I knew I wasn't just the shadow. I was the joke. But here's where the story begins to turn. Because sometimes the people who watch you from the back of the room are watching more closely than anyone else. And on the day that would become my reckoning, someone stepped forward who wore their name but had my heart. The wedding itself was everything my childhood wasn't: warm, inclusive, and soaked in real love, not some performance for appearances. We held it at a restored art museum downtown, candles flickering off polished stone, a string quartet folding softly into the architecture. My wife, Elise, walked down the aisle in a simple dress that made her look like she stepped out of a quiet dream, and every face that mattered was there to witness it. Every face except two. My parents' seats were empty. Not just empty, they were ghosts at the table, placeholders for people who decided my joy wasn't worth their time. I wish I could say I didn't care, that I was too wrapped in happiness to notice. But I noticed. Every time Elise's family clinked glasses or shared stories, I felt the hollow where mine should have been. I saw how her father held her mother's hand through the speeches. How her siblings cheered louder than the band when we kissed. I watched and wondered what kind of man I might have been if my own family had rooted for me like that. But then halfway through the night, just after dinner and before the first dance, the DJ played something I hadn't requested. A slow, wistful jazz piece I used to hum at the edge of my bed as a kid. I froze. Because that song had only one memory attached to it. Natalie. I turned toward the entrance, and there she stood. Tall, poised, and beautiful in a navy blue dress that carried just enough weight to make you wonder who she was. My half-sister. The one my father had years before me, and whom he all but erased when he started over with my mother. They never talked about her. She was the family's closed book. But I had found her. Years ago, in a fog of late-night curiosity, I tracked her down quietly. I wasn't sure what I was looking for: closure. An ally? But what I got was something else entirely: a mirror. Natalie knew what it meant to be discarded, to grow up as a footnote in someone else's success story. And over time, we built something no one saw coming. She became my confidant. I became her anchor. And when Elise and I got engaged, she was the first to send champagne and say, "Don't let them shrink you on your big day. Let them miss it." Now she was here. In front of everyone. Wearing the last name they gave her, the one they tried to forget. She smiled and walked directly toward me. People moved instinctively, like they knew something important was about to happen. And as the music faded, she took the mic from the DJ and said 5 words that flipped the night on its head. "I'd like to give a toast." There was a murmur. A few heads tilted. Elise gave me a questioning glance, and I nodded. Natalie lifted her glass and began. "To my brother Ian. The man you don't forget once you've met him." The crowd chuckled. She continued, "I wasn't supposed to be part of this family, and he wasn't supposed to shine. At least, not according to the people who raised yous or failed to. But Ian built his own light. He never asked anyone to hand him a torch. He lit the match himself. And tonight I want to thank him for reminding me that family isn't who names you, it's who shows up." Silence. That deep, hanging silence that presses in when a truth finally lands. I watched tears bloom in Elisa's eyes. I saw our friends nod in quiet respect. I even noticed one of my aunts, who hadn't known about Natalie, cover her mouth in shock. The ripple was real. A crack in the perfect narrative my parents always tried to preserve. I hugged Natalie. Not the polite kind. The kind you hold on to, so you don't fall apart. Because for the first time, someone had spoken aloud the thing I wasn't allowed to say for decades. I mattered. I mattered in the ways that couldn't be measured in trophies or Ivy League acceptance letters. I mattered because I endured. And I mattered because someone else said so, in public, without shame. After that, the night bloomed in a way I couldn't have planned. Guests who barely knew me started pulling me aside, saying things like, "That was powerful," or, "You're lucky to have each other." Elisa's father, who had been reserved around me at first, clapped me on the back and said, "That toast took courage." I respect that. Even the DJ winked and said, "You got family that shows up in a storm." That's rare. The funny thing is, my parents called the next day. No congratulations. No apology. Just a voicemail. "We heard Natalie was there. We'd appreciate it if you kept things private moving forward." No acknowledgement of the wedding. No warmth. Just damage control. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. I deleted the message without listening twice. Because the people who couldn't show up for me when it counted didn't get to control the story anymore. What they didn't realize was they missed their last chance to see me as I truly was. Not the screw-up. Not the second place. But the man who built his own table, filled it with real love, and left no seat open for the ones who never cared to stay. The strange thing about closure is that it never comes wrapped in a bow. Sometimes it creeps in through the back door when you've finally stopped waiting at the front. The morning after the wedding, I sat on the balcony of our hotel suite, still in dress pants, bare feet on cold tile, holding a lukewarm coffee. Elise slept soundly inside, her dress draped across a chair like a collapsed dream. I should have been exhausted. Instead, I was wide awake, replaying every second of Natalie's toast, every shocked face, every moment I finally felt seen. I thought about my parents. How predictable they were. I could almost hear them arguing behind closed doors, my father pacing like he did when he lost control of a meeting. My mother's tight whisper, "How could he invite her?" But they never asked themselves the better question, why wouldn't I? Growing up, my father obsessed over optics. Every birthday party was a photo op. Every family dinner was a press release. But behind the lens, there was no affection, only assessment. Was I measuring up? Was I living out their design? I wasn't a son. I was a brand extension. And when I started stepping out of that box, choosing my own major, refusing to join his firm, dating a woman with a spine, they didn't fight harder for me. They erased me. That morning, I realized something sobering. They weren't just absent from my wedding. They were absent from my life. For years, I tried to earn my place at their table. But the truth was, I had built a better one. And suddenly, the idea of chasing their approval felt like chasing ghosts. I didn't want their seat anymore. I wanted distance. Elise stirred awake and came out to join me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders without a word. We didn't need to speak. Her warmth was enough. But then she surprised me. "Natalie left you something," she said, placing a slim envelope on my lap. Inside was a single photo. Us, as kids, in grainy black and white. Natalie maybe 9, me maybe 4, her arms looped around me like a shield. It must have been one of the rare visits I had no memory of. On the back, in her handwriting, just 5 words. "They forgot." I never did. I exhaled slowly. That was the day it all locked into place. I wasn't abandoned. I was released. Over the next few weeks, life returned to a strange rhythm. Elise and I moved into our new apartment, a space that felt more like ours than anything I'd known growing up. We hosted dinners, adopted a dog, even talked about kids. I should have been basking in newlywed bliss. But something gnawed at me. a quiet urge to not just survive the damage but rewrite it. I didn't want revenge in the classic sense. I didn't need an apology or a meltdown. What I wanted was to flip the narrative. My parents spent their lives controlling who was celebrated and who was silenced. And they'd done it mostly through omission. Through invitations never sent, milestones ignored. But I had a voice now. I had my own reach. So I started writing. At first, just essays. Personal reflections published under a pen name. Stories about invisibility. About the quiet warfare of favoritism. About being the kid who learned to applaud others while staying silent in the corner. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The truth always recognizes itself. The articles caught fire. One went viral. Then another. A podcast invited me to speak. Then a publisher called. And just like that, the screw-up became a source. A mirror for others like me who'd been cast aside by the people meant to love them first. Messages poured in. Strangers saying things like, "I thought it was just me," or, "Your story gave me permission to stop chasing." One day, Elise walked into my office with a look I hadn't seen before, part awe, part disbelief. "You're trending again," she said, holding up her phone. The headline read, "Anonymous essayist behind viral Forgotten Child series revealed as tech exec Ian Carson." Just like that, my name hit national news. I braced myself. Within hours, I got the email I'd been expecting, but still, it hit like a cold slap. Subject line: "We need to talk." Sender: Dad. He hadn't used my name. Just a generic opener. "We've seen what you've been putting out into the world. While we respect your accomplishments, we are deeply hurt by your decision to air personal matters publicly. This could have been handled privately, as a family." I laughed out loud. The idea that they wanted privacy after decades of public erasure was rich. I almost replied. Almost. But I knew better. You don't argue with ghosts. You walk through them. I never responded. Instead, I booked Natalie a speaking slot at my first book launch. She walked on stage in a navy suit, her voice calm and precise. And when she introduced me, she said, "This is my brother Ian. He's not just a writer. He's a survivor of silence. And tonight, we're going to speak the names of everyone who was told they weren't enough." The crowd rose. I stepped into the light. And for once, I wasn't alone. I was never just a family screw-up. I was the spark they didn't see coming. That night, after the book launch, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence more deafening than applause. Elise slept beside me, curled into a warm silhouette of peace, but my mind wouldn't shut off. All I could hear was my father's email echoing in my skull. This could have been handled privately, as if he hadn't made my rejection a public ceremony at every turn of my life. As if silence hadn't been their loudest weapon. No, I wasn't going to handle this privately. Not anymore. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Interview requests, invitations, panels, TEDx. Somehow, I had become a voice people clung to, not because I was profound, but because I told the truth most families buried. There's something magnetic about that when people hear their pain in your words. I never expected to be a mirror, but now I was one. And oddly, that gave me clarity. My publisher wanted me to write a second book, this time about reconciliation. I hesitated. The idea of forgiving people who still pretended I didn't exist felt like swallowing glass. But Elise nudged me toward it. "You don't have to forgive them for their sake," she said. "Do it for your own peace." So I wrote. Slowly. Carefully. Chapter by chapter. Not to defend them, but to understand myself. The roots. The shame. The small, hungry child I used to be, pressing his nose against the living room window while the rest of the family laughed and sighed. The drafts were brutal to write, but I noticed something strange. Each chapter took some weight off my chest. Not all at once, but bit by bit, I could breathe easier. Then a letter came. Handwritten. No return address, but the cursive was unmistakable. My mother. She didn't apologize. Not exactly. She wrote about memories I didn't remember, things I'd done as a child that made her smile. And then, tucked at the bottom of the last page, she wrote, "Maybe we were wrong. Maybe you didn't fail us, maybe we failed you." I read that line over and over. It didn't undo the damage. It didn't excuse the decades of distance. But it cracked something open, not for her, but for me. It was the first time they had let go of the myth that I was the problem. The screw-up. The embarrassment. The black sheep. That admission didn't ask for forgiveness. It simply acknowledged what was real. And sometimes, that's more powerful than an apology. I didn't write back. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to anymore. I had moved on. My silence now wasn't fear, it was peace. I didn't owe them anything. And in that, I felt free for the first time. Life took on a rhythm. I launched a mentorship foundation for overlooked kids. We called it The Table. The idea was simple. If no one invites you to sit down, build your own. Every year, we chose 10 students who had been dismissed by their families, schools, or systems and gave them what I never had, belief. Natalie joined the board. She'd never had kids of her own, but the way she mentored those students, you'd think she raised a dozen. Watching her, I realized something else too. Revenge doesn't always look like burning bridges. Sometimes, it looks like building homes. One day, I got a text from my cousin, Alicia. She'd been one of the quiet ones in the family, the ones who watched things unfold without interference. But this time, she said, "Hey, Grandma's 90th is next month. Everyone's asking if you're coming." I stared at that message for 10 minutes. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because it was the first time anyone had asked. I went. Not to prove anything. Not to cause a scene. I went because the old fear that they'd look at me and see failure no longer held power. I walked in wearing a tailored suit, hand in hand with Elise, with Natalie at my other side. The room went quiet for a beat, then burst into fake smiles and awkward nods. I didn't need their approval anymore. I made my rounds politely. I hugged Grandma. Thanked the caterers. Complimented the centerpieces. I even shook my father's hand, not warmly, but without venom. And when he asked how I'd been, I just smiled. Better than ever. At the end of the night, as we were leaving, a young cousin, maybe 17, pulled me aside. "Hey," he said nervously, "I read your book." I didn't know we were allowed to talk about stuff like that. I looked him in the eyes and said, "We weren't. But now we are." That was it. The full circle. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just earned. We left quietly. Elise squeezed my hand as we walked to the car. "You good?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah. For the first time in a long time, I actually am." The drive home was silent, but not heavy. Just calm. Like the storm had finally passed. I didn't need applause. I didn't need closure from people who were never open to begin with. What I had now, peace, love, purpose, was more than they ever offered. And that, I realized, was the real win. The months after my mother's note were a revelation, not because the past suddenly healed, but because the future opened space I didn't know existed. With the table now well underway, I found myself partnering with organizations, investors, and educators. I traveled to urban schools where kids were running programs from cardboard boxes and basements. I mentored alongside Natalie, watching her connect with shy teens whose eyes lit up when someone said they mattered. It was the kind of quiet justice I craved, nothing flashy, but deeply, miraculously effective. I'd always thought revenge had to be loud grand gestures, public reckonings. But now I saw how power, used wisely, bends silence into strength. When we gave laptops to students who lived in shelters, when we helped them launch their first online stores, I realized I was giving them what I never had, a seat at their own table. Not because someone told them they belong, but because they chose to belong. And that change didn't come with applause, it came with trust earned over time, over coffee meetings and library basements, over late-night strategy calls and curriculum planning. It came because someone believed when everyone else looked away. During one of those planning sessions, I got an email from a documentary filmmaker who'd followed the table's progress. He'd seen my TEDx speech, the viral essays, the launch with Natalie. He wanted to capture the work in film. I didn't hesitate. If I was going to hold the mic, I'd let the spotlight shine where it needed to, on the kids, on the mentors, on the message that no one gets to decide your worth. Shooting started in my old neighborhood. The director captured scenes of me walking my childhood street, exchanging nods with neighbors who remembered. That quiet kid. He filmed me at breakfast with Elise in my new kitchen, sunlight streaming and the dog barking at the door. And he filmed more poignant moments, me in my mother's room, helping her sort old photo albums, gently confronting framed praise for Clara, asking the question she finally paused at. "Why didn't you ask me once?" She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she held my hand. That stillness was enough. As filming continued, something else happened. My parents started accepting public appearances. My mother, once invisible, became a bored observer on the table. My father offered to match donation pledges at an event. They stepped up. But I watched them closely, cautious. I wasn't seeking grand gestures. I wanted alignment. Did their actions reflect what they'd said? At the gala to launch the documentary, the hall was filled with students I'd watched evolve, once shy teenagers now speaking on stage, discussing policy change, pressing for equity. When the film premiered, my parents sat in the front row. They were older now, lines etched from years of pretense and pride. But as the camera shifted to show my face, my eyes, my resolve, they looked the way people do when they realize they helped build something larger than themselves. When the credits rolled, there wasn't thunderous applause, just a room that exhaled. My parents stood first, hugging each other and turning toward me. My mother's voice cracked. "Thank you?" My father's nod said more than any script could. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't absolution. But it was something. And sometimes, something is enough. Later, standing outside in the spotlight that wasn't mine, I thought about the kid who'd sung that jazz tune at his own wedding, the young man who built a table when no chair would come for him. I thought about Natalie, Elise, the students I'd come to champion, and the family who'd finally shown up. I didn't need their belated attendance to affirm my worth, but I allowed it to be quietly meaningful. Because true power isn't grabbing what you deserve, it's building what they can't take away. When the documentary went live, the world responded in unexpected ways. Messages flooded in, not from old classmates or distant relatives, but from people I never knew existed, grown-ups who'd been silenced as children, spouses whose voices had been ignored at kitchen tables, managers passed over for promotions they earned. They wrote to say, "Thank you for building the table." They spoke of how they'd seen themselves in my story and decided to speak up. My inbox became a living archive of reclaimed identities. And every night, I'd read one more message that nudged my heart to believe that my life had meaning beyond my own journey. Yet, amid the ripple effect, something curious happened. My parents shut their distance. Not completely. There were no long apologies. No emotional rescues. But they began attending events quietly, front row at student showcases, offering nods when cameras caught them, standing alongside Natalie and me at press conferences. My mother's voice had strengthened, less brittle than before. My father's smile didn't hide behind pride, it leaned into humility. They showed up not to claim ownership, but to witness. In one particular moment, I saw the shift. At the documentary's gala, a student who had once refused to open her eyes in class stepped onto the stage. She shared how she'd built her first business because we told her she could. Her voice shook. Mine shook too, in the wings. My father, standing next to me, touched my shoulder. At first I recoiled reflex, but then I felt his warmth. I looked at him. He nodded, no words. Just acknowledgement. That gesture carried more weight than 1,000 apologies. The night ended with standing ovations, tears, and hugs. But the real moment came afterward, when my parents and Natalie and Elise surrounded me in a quiet corner of the ballroom. My mother's eyes glistened as she said, "You showed us what it means to speak your truth. We failed to speak ours. Thank you for giving us a mirror." My father added in a gentle voice, "We'll never fully understand your fight, but we promise not to stand in the way anymore." That confession, uttered humbly and without fanfare, was real. It wasn't a dramatic climax. It was the quiet chord of a life rebalanced. For decades, I'd believed they held my narrative hostage. Tonight they let it go. Now, as I sit in my office walls lined with photos of kids whose paths changed because someone saw them, whose parents still send letters saying, "You gave our child a voice," I realize that revenge, redemption, and legacy aren't mutually exclusive. You can let go of bitterness and still hold power. You can forgive without forgetting. You can transform your absence into presence and, in doing so, invite others to find their own seat at the table. I keep my father's final text from that night on my desk. "Proud of you." 2 words. Truer than any empty praise he'd given before. I don't need more from them. I need only to keep building, teaching, giving others the quiet permission I'd found in the absence of acknowledgement. The past taught me that love withheld is often the loudest betrayal. But the future has taught me that the love you give yourself, the table you build, the voice you speak, the lives you touch can become a louder legacy than any family accolade or heirloom. And walking into rooms where echoes of rejection once haunted, I now carry something stronger. Proof that your story doesn't belong to anyone else, but to you. In the end, revenge didn't look like yelling or public humiliation. It wasn't a stage or a mic drop or a televised spectacle. It was quieter than that, sharper. My revenge was the calm of success forged in silence, the power of rising without applause, and the strength of knowing I had no need to be seen by those who once overlooked me. When they refused me a seat, I built a room. When they erased my worth, I carved it into history. And when they called me a disappointment, I let their words echo into irrelevance. What changed me wasn't the vindication of headlines or the praise of strangers. It was the peace I found in choosing not to carry their rejection as my identity anymore. I put it down, slowly, like a weight I didn't realize I'd been gripping all these years. I let it go, and in its place, I held purpose, real, grounded, lasting purpose. Elise knows her father for who he is, not who he was told to be. My wife, Natalie, never asked me to prove myself, she just stayed when others left. And now, in the stillness of our life, I feel no need to revisit the pain. I just acknowledge it, thank it for what it taught me, and walk past it. So if you've ever been seated with the servers, called the screw up, told your voice didn't matter, hear this: your value isn't up for debate. The table you build will outlast the ones you were shut out of. Trust that. Live that. And one day, you'll look around and realize you never needed their permission to rise.